welcome to the first Terrascope Climate Cafe. So I wanted to start with a little bit about what are climate cafes. So this is going to be a bi-monthly fireside chat series where we invite esteemed guests who share our passion and purpose to turn climate talk into action. And so our goal with the climate cafes is for us at Terrascope and other professionals to get inspired and be creative. And I wanted to really talk about creativity because it's about kind of understanding the traditional values and norms and way the world works and thinking about how do we motivate and inspire new models, new frameworks, new things to help create the future and pave the way. So really that's what creativity as a decarbonization platform is, where we sit. So we're at the intersection of data science, of machine learning, of engineering, and of climate change, and of policy and regulation. So we bring all these different disciplines together into a theory of change for the SaaS tech company to provide insights to corporate decision makers who then take decisions that influence the flow of capital and money to change, kind of address climate change and change how the world is working for our 1.5 future. So that's our big mission for Climate Cafes, and I think there's really no better person to kick us off than Dr. Angel Hsu. So she is an incredibly versatile person. I mean, someone who sits so squarely in the data science and also the global policy. So we have a data geek and a global policy influencer, and to be able to straddle that world so effectively. So Angel founded the data-driven environmental policy lab, and she sits on a federal government committee that talks about US-China relations for her energy and environment background. And she's incredibly local and also global. So she, an assistant professor of environmental studies at Yale NUS here in Singapore, the Singapore College. So she lived here for a number of years and today teaches at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So Angel has also, that's my local lens, and my global lens for Angel is that she has written for a very famous body called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the go-to body for climate science. So Angel has actually authored the latest report, so chapters of it, and also the UN Environment's iconic emissions gap report. So really drawing in and influencing kind of the global policy. So Angel's lab uses data-driven approaches to, and I quote, create solutions to the world's environmental problems. So a similarly ambitious and driven person, very much in good company with Terrascope. And Angel and I met actually at the Yale School of Environment, where she was doing her PhD in environmental policy. And so it's really my pleasure to welcome you to Terrascope to join our company and talk to our team here today. So I wanted to just turn over to you and set the scene with your professional career. I've kind of outlined it, but I'd love to know, so why do you use data to address climate change? What is the data that you use, and how has it evolved over the past 15 years, the past 5 years, and even over the past year itself and the pace of change?
Well, thank you so much, Lia, for organizing this and for inviting me here. This is so exciting to learn more about Terrascope and the work that you're doing, and really, I think, putting the mission that I've been working on for the last decade, 15 years, into action. So I'm really excited to also hear from you about what you're doing, what challenges you're facing in the space. So I'll just start by answering Lia's question. So I guess my first job out of grad school was working at the World Resources Institute, and I worked on a project called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Initiative. And at that point, it was really the only game in town when it came to accounting tools and methodologies to help companies and also organizations and governments measure their greenhouse gas emissions. And we used the famous motto, I'm actually happy that you don't have this plastered somewhere in this office, but you can't manage what you don't measure, and you can't manage well what you don't measure well. So I think we all have this tattooed somewhere on our bodies, right? Because it's such a core part of our mantra. And that's when I started to really understand the value of data. And I think in the private sector, it has long been recognized that you need to have solid data to make decisions. You need key performance indicators, KPIs. You need to be measuring your returns on investment. But for environmental policy and for climate change, that wasn't necessarily a given. And so working on this project really opened my eyes to why you need to have solid data to underpin climate policies that are robust and that are science-based. And so I was working in many developing countries. I was working with governments and local business organizations in Mexico, Brazil, India, Philippines and China. And that's really where I really had my eyes open to why you need to have better data to underpin climate. And so they sent me to China. My Chinese was awful at the time. I could barely speak Chinese, but it's like I know a little bit more than other people in my office. And so I helped to open up their office there. And then working with Chinese businesses and the government, realizing that there was such a strong appetite for data. They really wanted to know, how do we manage energy consumption? China at that time had skyrocketing double-digit growth rates of GDP, and they were facing electricity shortages. Huge amounts of energy was being consumed by factories that they were trying to build. And so they really wanted to get a handle of how can we be more efficient in our energy? How can we reduce energy consumption? And underpinning that was, of course, data, knowing what sectors are consuming energy and what processes are the most energy efficient, which ones are least. And then my foot in the door was telling them, hey, when you account for energy, when you measure and manage energy, you're also impacting climate change emissions. And so that was really, I think, the entry into and helping them understand that these things are connected, and that if you manage your energy, you can get ahead on climate change policy. China, even though they didn't recognize it until several years later, they were quickly overcoming the United States as being the #1 emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And so regulation was coming down the way. And so I was working and selling this to Chinese businesses, saying, if you learn the GHG protocol, if you adapt these tools for the Chinese context now, develop those localized emissions factors for the cement sector, oil and gas, those are the sectors I worked most closely in, then you're going to get ahead. You're going to be able to protect those baselines. So we had to do a lot of selling, like, why would you want to do this? Why would you want to invest the time? And was really trying to make the case. And then I think 10 years after that, it's really, like even 15, I guess that was 17, almost 17 years ago now. Now I think the way it's changed is that you no longer have to sell the idea of data to companies. I think they all recognize in the ESG space and climate change, for climate change purposes, they all need to have data. They all need to have some idea of what their carbon footprints are, their greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that it's I no longer have to convince them that data is something that they should all be investing in, they should all be collecting. But then I think now it's really trying to convince companies of valuing data in the appropriate way. I think that that's been something that's challenging, where people, they all want to have data, but they just assume that it'll just magically appear out of thin air and that it's not something they have to invest in. So I think that's something. And then in the last year, it's really has been just this explosion of the next generation of measurement and accounting, and how can we incorporate, as you said in your introduction of Terrascope, machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I was just talking to a couple of colleagues in Lia about this idea of digital twins and these new types of simulations and models that now are overtaking a lot of the world. And so it's a lot of how do we design the systems of the future to help address the problems that, frankly, we have not been able to address in the last 15 years in terms of data. I mean, it's mind-boggling. We just went up to CDP's office, and I remember working with them in 2005, 2006, when they were just getting off the ground, and they were using the same tactics of sending out their disclosures and asking companies to collect that data, to self-report, use emissions factors, say what emission factors they're using, what's their boundary, what methodology are they using. And it's shocking that today we still expect companies to do the same, to take the greenhouse gas protocol, ISO 14064 Part 1, whatever they use, and then go in and do it themselves. And to me, that's just very outdated thinking. Like, we need to be thinking of, okay, well, how do I actually incorporate a lot of these next generation technologies and tools to help me make my inventories a lot more efficient and effective?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, on this note of like standards and training, so the reason when I was like, I have to get Angel here was when I was looking at the GHG Management Institute and saw that you had co-authored the corporate standard exam. And actually there's very few ways for a corporate or anybody who wants to get certified on the corporate standard to have that like credential and kind of move forward. So when I saw that you had authored it, I was like, I've got to bring her in, because we've actually got team members who are in the process of undergoing that exam.
Oh, that's
it's
great.
It's a great opportunity to kind of to upskill. And
well, I won't accept bribes. So don't try.
Yeah, but the insight, she'll help you out. But I'd love to know, so, you know, right now, if we look at where we're at, the GHG protocol is updating their scope 3 value chain standard. And you've been in this space for so long. Like, where do you think it's going? What's next for GHG management and accounting, and especially around kind of the scope 3 value chain? that companies have.
Yeah, I mean, that's just starting to scratch the surface of Scope 3, really. And I mean, when we started to come up with project accounting standards, that was to support the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. So these were projects primarily in developing countries to get carbon credits and access to international carbon markets. And of course, that's shifted because now every country, regardless if you're China or Singapore or Nigeria or the United States, we all have to do something on climate change. Mm-hmm. So I think it's shifted, but what we're realizing is that Scope 3 is so much more complicated than we thought. I mean, in the early days of developing the Scope 3 accounting guidelines and then developing the project accounting standard, it was really, there's just a couple of examples. A lot of it was based in the forestry sector. You had a couple of places that were doing some of this embodied supply chain carbon footprinting stuff, but I think what we're realizing is that it's so much more complicated than we originally thought. And so I think being able to develop more detailed guidance is the start, but I think there's a lot more that really can be done. And I think the part that is really important now is the fact that the commitments and the targets are now outpacing what we have in terms of data available and also the methodology. So I think there's going to need to be a lot more innovation. And one of the projects that my lab also is a conspirator of is the Net Zero Tracker. And so we have a website where we actually give a scorecard to all the Forbes 2000 companies, all the major cities and the regional governments and countries. And we look, have you identified a clear interim target? Have you specified a net zero target that includes all emission scopes? Do you include offsets? And it's shocking the number of companies that don't specify whether or not they use offsets. They don't report Scope 3 emissions. Mm-hmm. And it's largely because we haven't yet really fully, I think, gotten a handle around Scope 3 emissions. And I think it all goes back to the fact that we still don't really have a good handle on Scope 1 emissions. Mm-hmm. In a lot of places, particularly in the global south, where there is not a regulatory environment that's requiring mandatory disclosure. I mean, U.S. is just now in the SEC talking about mandatory Scope 1 disclosure for major firms. I mean, that to me is mind-boggling. I mean, China is now outpacing the United States in this regard. Like, China has now already passed this type of mandatory disclosure for companies. And so, I mean, I think there's still really a lot. So to me, it's just really being able to get more regulation on Scope 1 emissions, particularly from key markets in the global south where there isn't, and even the United States where there isn't good data. And then that will help feed into our ability to then be able to evaluate more deeply along the supply chain for Scope 3. And then I think, yes, the machine learning and the AI, exactly as you're doing at Terrascope, should be really helpful in taking the data that we do have and trying to estimate to get a starting point for what Scope 3 emissions might be for other companies where it's just simply too difficult to get that data.
So if we kind of have a situation where, okay, so your lab is assessing corporate action,
Yes.
but we know the limitations around data. So
Yes.
how do you kind of close that loop? Do you I guess you see regulation as a driving force?
Yes.
But
Yeah, absolutely.
regulations also will
Yeah.
look to companies. How ready are you to kind of be able to comply with it? So what do you see as really driving the situation forward to get to where we need to be, which is companies acting on
Yeah,
climate change?
exactly. I mean, it's got to be like an all-directional, multi-directional effort, an all-hands-on-deck effort. And I think we've seen in different policy cycles, and yeah, I mean, you were in a negotiator seat, so you know how slow policy can really move a lot of times. And so for a while it was really, and this was in the lead up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, a lot of companies themselves saying, we're going to step up, we want to get that extra leadership credit, we want to reputationally build our brand as being a leader in this space. And then the UN saw that happening and they said, you know what, we should just bring them on board because we can't beat them, so we might as well have them join us. And then I think what they've now realized, and this came with Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General at COP26 in 2021, saying, we cannot keep treating nature like a toilet, and this can be a lot of greenwashing from companies, so we need to take a step back, really evaluate what these companies are doing. Now that the ambition is there, the momentum has been built, we need the credibility, we need the accountability. And so actually it's been interesting to see these different ways of target setting, of companies kind of stepping ahead and trying to get credit for early action, and then the regulators kind of coming back in and saying, well, wait a second, we need to regulate this, we need to have better standards and more transparency that can generate the accountability that we all want to further drive climate action. So we're in this phase now where I think the recognition is there. A lot of companies, they realize that we have to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. They want to align their corporate climate actions with those scientific goals. So they've made those pledges, but where the research is now uncovering is that a lot of these targets, our net zero tracker is part of this. Colleagues that we work with at New Climate Institute, they just published their second corporate climate responsibility monitor, which shows that really no company, and it's actually interesting, all the big tech companies, Microsoft, Apple, Google, they are nowhere near to setting credible targets. They're nowhere near to coming forth with the data that shows that their actions are actually credible and actually in line with what the science says. And so it's been interesting to see, but I think it's a push and pull between policy and regulation, as you said, and then also voluntary action. I think also stakeholder pressure. I think the youth movement has been absolutely instrumental in applying pressure to governments and also to companies and being credible. So to me, it's kind of coming at all directions, but definitely it comes in cycles, and we need to constantly apply pressure from all angles in order to make sure that we see some follow through.
Yeah, so let's dig into the credibility. So I guess where we're at now is a lot of companies, might have done one or two inventories, a couple might have done many more. A lot of set targets that might be, do you see science-based targets initiative as a source of credibility for target setting? And then beyond that, like, where do you look for credibility based on, I guess, the work that you do in the environmental lab for corporate at a more granular level, right? So how do you assess individual company kind of credibility throughout the net zero journey?
So that's a really great question, and we're still we're still working on it and still trying to figure it out. And of course, the UN convened this high-level expert group that released their report last December, or I guess November, at the COP27, that actually goes through all these principles for corporate and other subnational and financial institutions. I think that's like an even bigger black box. I mean, the corporates are at least ahead of the financial institutions. I think they really, really need to really get their act together, because there's just very little transparency, particularly amongst private investors and in their investment portfolios. I mean, that whole piece is, I think, the area where we need a lot more societal pressure to get those companies to be a lot more transparent, especially on scope 3. But yeah, so for companies, I think, and I don't want to bash on like science-based targets too much, but what we're finding is that a lot of companies that are signing up to the science-based target initiatives, frankly, are not setting targets that are actually in line with the scientific scenarios, and are not being clear about how offsets are being accounted for and whether or not they're being used, and also scope 3 emissions. So to me, that's a huge credibility gap. And what we look for is exactly some of those elements that I mentioned, and then we have a scorecard on the net zero tracker that goes through. And so they have to be really clear about, okay, well, what's the base year that our target is starting from? They need to have a clear end target year. When are they going to accomplish that particular goal? And then really notably, are they setting an interim target? So near-term action is incredibly important. So not just have they set a target in 2040, 2050, 2060, when the current CEO of a particular company is probably not going to be in power when those years are actually in place. And so the near-term target, what are you doing in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years? That's really where we're looking to see what are they doing. And of course, we can model those efforts. We can take their baseline inventory. We can then, exactly as Terrascope does, you can then see, okay, well, if they want to hit their net zero target by 2050 or 2040, what does at minimum that interim target need to be? And have they established a credible level of reductions in line with that particular scenario? So I think that's really key. And then we look for things like, have they reported their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions? Within those emission scopes, what sectors are they reporting? Are they the majority of emissions in those scopes? And we can benchmark those according to other companies in that sector. And so if there are other companies within their sector that are reporting significant process or other emissions, are they also doing the same? So that's also a big piece. But it takes, for the corporate climate responsibility monitor, it takes about 2 days to go through, of one researcher, like a skilled researcher's time, to go through all the documentation, all of their CDP reports, all of their CSR reports, their strategies to actually do that evaluation. And then, offsets. Are they using offsets? And if they are using offsets, to then, I think the offsets, they cannot just be a substitute for reducing emissions. So I think that's also another big thing. Are they actually pledging to reduce their emissions all the way to zero or as close as possible? And then if they are offsetting, how are those offsets being achieved? Are they permanent, or are they forest or land-based? and how are those offsets also being accounted for? What methods, what protocols are being used? But it's, yeah, I mean, we have, I think, something like 25, 30 indicators that we use to evaluate the credibility of a net zero target. So it's a pretty intensive process, and I'm not remembering all of the indicators off the top of my head, but I think those are the big ones. Yeah, those are the key ones.
So we'll switch into data science, but I want to understand your thinking around. So we have a lot of mandatory disclosures, which are more kind of what's happening today, but where do you see the regulation and the legislation going for thinking about that credibility piece? So do you see laws coming that kind of take some of these 20 checklists for what credibility means in the corporate space and holding that more accountability there? So what's next for like the regulatory trend in kind of corporate climate action and decarbonization?
Yeah, it's really tricky because now we're starting to see in some contexts that companies are getting sued for not having actually credible net zero targets or plans to back them up. And so I think we may see regulation going along those lines, like probably not in the United States, but I'm thinking about in the Netherlands, for example, where Shell was sued. I mean, they had said that we are going to be net zero, and then people started to dive. Yeah, exactly. I'm seeing some very confused looks. Exactly. But that's exactly what happened, is that they have now been sued because people started to dig into their reports and their CSR documents and their plans. And it turns out they were not including the end use of their products, which is the majority of their emissions. I mean, they're an oil and gas extraction, refining, and petroleum product company. It's like, if you don't account for the scope 3 emissions, then there's no way that you can be credible when you're only looking at your operational emissions. I mean, it was completely insane. So they got sued. So yeah, I think absolutely companies are going to start to be held accountable through regulation for the credibility of their plans and ensuring that they are being comprehensive in their reporting. And the SEC regulations in the United States are starting with scope 1, but that will really go a huge way. The fact that we don't have mandatory disclosure, I mean, to me, that this is already 20 years too late. And so the fact that once we actually get that on the books, I think that will really help. It's just like, frankly, and then, yeah, getting them to just disclose scope 1. But yeah, I mean, I think the credibility piece, because now companies are being sued, I think that's that could signal that there would be more regulation. But it also on the flip side of this, I've also heard of some companies being concerned that they're going to be sued for antitrust and collusion and monopolizing. And so when I first heard this, I thought this was absolutely ridiculous, where we were getting requests and concerns from companies saying, oh, well, I don't know if I can sign on to this initiative where everyone is pledging net zero or decarbonization by a certain date, because this could be seen as a monopolistic type of business activity and collusion. And I literally laughed out loud. And then I spoke with a friend who's a lawyer, and she said, no, this is actually something that companies are going to be concerned, that they're actually very really, honestly concerned about. And so I think that hopefully maybe there will be some legislation that can say, okay, well, this type of activity, working together towards a common goal on climate change, is not going to be considered monopolistic behavior, and it won't be subject to antitrust type of legislation. So those are just two different sides of the coin to consider.
Interesting, yeah, because scope 3 especially, it's all about collaboration.
Yes.
And especially data sharing and bringing competitors together to kind of solve a common problem. So that seems like a really important barrier. So shifting gears into kind of the data science and artificial intelligence and some of the data-driven approaches that you do. So in your experience, when do you see metrics driving action? So, beyond just kind of understanding, does understanding always lead to action, or do you kind of have a mental model for when it really is going to be the missing ingredient and the thing that will catalyze outcome?
Yeah, this is such a fascinating question, and actually it came up this morning at this conference I attended at National University of Singapore, because a lot of times the scientists and the academics, the engineers, we're just thinking about the data, the awesome models, the really cool visualizations, and we just automatically assume that if we build it, the policy making will come, the decision makers will come, they'll flock to it, they'll automatically take the insights and apply them into action. And that's really very rarely the case. And so I was, as you mentioned, I was part of this government committee this past summer that was convened by the National Academy of Sciences. So we were a 10 expert committee of people who are trying to think about how can we actually innovate greenhouse gas emissions information for decision makers. And one of the findings of this report is exactly this, that there's this huge gap, there's a gulf between the people who are generating data and the scientists, the modelers, the startups, and the decision makers. And so we need to develop a framework and a way of working better together to close that loop, because it's not a given. And I think that's one of the things I've realized in more than 15 years of working in the space, that often you can spend so much time like innovating the methods, and you come up with these like amazing models, and your R squared values are off the charts, and you're like, oh my God, this is like going to be revolutionary. And then it's just crickets, and you realize that the decision makers, maybe they don't understand the process that you use, the methods that you use to develop the data. They don't trust it. They lack the transparency in terms of understanding everything that went into it, or they lack the mandate, or they don't have the analytical capacity internally to then know what to do with that data. So these were all issues that surfaced when we were developing this report. We invited a lot of businesses and end users of data, governments, to actually try to understand like where are the bottlenecks in actually taking data and applying it. And so one of the conclusions that we made and also put into the report is that there needs to be a lot more partnership and collaboration and synergy between the data providers and the end users themselves. And it seems like such an obvious thing, but it actually doesn't happen as much as people would like, especially the scientists. I feel like in academia, I mean, even the position of NUS relative to downtown or where the government is just, there's physical distance, and a lot of that is enough of a barrier to then have the scientists kind of operate in their own silos, develop these very complicated atmospheric models, these machine learning models using all this AI that frankly in a lot of cases is not adapted or tailored to a context that decision makers can readily adapt. And so there needs to be, I think, a lot more to really close that loop.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Angel. So I'd love to open up. I know we'll have some really important follow-ups from the team. So have we got any questions online or from the room to open up? Okay.
What is the key to bridging the gulf between people generating the data and the models and decision makers? Do you have any sort of like thoughts or experiences around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just as simple as talking to each other. That would really go a long way. And that was actually one great thing I loved about being in Singapore, is that you do have the close proximity to policymakers. Like I could write an email to the Ministry of, the head climate change person in the Parliament, and they would come to campus, or they would meet with us, or I could have I'm going to the Urban Redevelopment Authority tomorrow to have a conversation, and the NEA and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, they were always really open to having these kinds of conversations. And one of the projects I was involved in was called Cooling Singapore, and we invited a dozen ministries and agencies in Singapore to come and hear about what we were planning in terms of this research project. And they gave us feedback on like what's useful, what they were already doing, the models that they were using, the data they were missing. And that kind of interaction is absolutely critical to making sure that you don't end up with this data product or this end research that then is never used or can't be taken up by government or decision makers. And so I think having those kinds of conversations, and unfortunately we're not having those nearly enough. And so I think the openness on the part of researchers and companies who are doing a lot of this innovation is needed. And then at the same time, I think on the other side, the end users, they also need to be more proactive and engaging. So whatever forum we can create to help facilitate those conversations, I think that's absolutely necessary. Because in that process of developing that report, I think it was really surprising. And I've had researchers tell me, they're like, yeah, we developed an ultra high resolution model of Indianapolis's emissions, and frankly, they don't use it. So it's like, what's the point? Like years and years went into this development of getting like very detailed traffic and car and transportation data, and then for some reason it wasn't used by the government. And so we have this one project called the Urban Environment and Social Inclusion Index, where we actually work with C40 cities. So we engaged them at the outset, and we said, hey, can you put us in touch with cities themselves? And so then we had a series of consultation webinars where we asked the city managers, we said, where are the data gaps? If we want to develop this indicator dashboard, like what indicators would be most useful to you? Where do you get your data from? And what would help facilitate your use of this data? Is it a really nice interactive dashboard? Is it simply having the data in a spreadsheet? Is it doing more webinars to socialize the idea of this project with key stakeholders. And I think that was a really helpful process in just better understanding from the user perspective what they needed. And for some reason that doesn't happen nearly enough. And I mean, it's time consuming, it's expensive, it's hard, it's like, who do I go talk to? And that all takes time. So I think having those conversations are really critical.
I have more questions, but before I jump in, let me open the floor. Yes.
Quick question for me. How do you think about, it's very interesting to see companies now decide to invest in decarbonization technologies
Yes.
and accelerate that movement versus maybe spending on offsets or other things, which is fantastic for potential outcomes. How do you think about sort of that type of movement catching on? Do you think it's a few companies that are thinking very forward thinking and also do the models of target setting, etc., capture and give credit for things like this? Should we do more as an industry?
This is also our CEO, by the way, Maya.
Oh, hi. That's a really excellent question. And I will say everyone should go and read the IPCC, the 6th Assessment Report Working Group 3, just the summary for policy, just the executive summary. Because if you read that, you would find that our number one conclusion is that we have all the technologies today available at our fingertips that are cost competitive to address climate change. That, I think, is the number one conclusion that really I try to communicate as much as possible, because everybody thinks it's like, oh, some technology that doesn't yet exist and we need to invest in all these future technologies to suck carbon out of the air or change the way we live or change our car. And yes, all of that's important, but for companies, what they mostly can do is just renewable energy, just investing in renewables. Wind and solar are now cost competitive. The cost of solar photovoltaic cells has decreased 85% in the last decade. Wind power also, huge reductions, 35 to 50% cheaper. So we have all those technologies available today, and the science that the IPCC synthesized to make that conclusion, it's all there. And so it just like really strikes me that we're still having the same conversation that we had a decade ago of companies saying, oh, I want to do the right thing, I want to act on climate change, but it's too expensive. Now there's no excuse because it's now affordable, and in many cases it's even cheaper, and it will net savings if companies invest in the technologies that we already have today. I mean, I do think that there are some areas in like hard to abate sectors, so iron and steel, some of these harder to abate sectors are going to be really hard for them to go all the way to zero emissions because they just have processes that emit greenhouse gases. So that's going to be really tough. And so those are the sectors where you might want to think about direct air capture and other types of permanent carbon storage solutions. But for everybody else, it's really, we have everything. And so perhaps it's lobbying local governments to allow greater access and tax incentives and tax breaks to increase the share of renewable electricity as part of the energy mix. Maybe it's lobbying for better building codes or stricter building codes and like working with building managers. So I think a lot of this stuff, we now have the science that definitively shows that it's available and it's more cost effective. And so to me, it's not about like these future technologies, it's about using the technologies that we have today. And that was, I think, one of the most powerful messages of the IPCC in this last round.
And so it relates to the trade-off between when to use carbon credits, when to kind of focus on reductions.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I would say focusing on reductions is the number one thing to do every time. Mm-hmm. Reduce everything that you can, and then in the off chance that it's not possible, then you look to offsets. Mm-hmm. But that's like a whole, I feel like you should have a whole other series of cafe chats on that because it's such a can of worms.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, so if we think about, the companies that we're working with, maybe 85% of their emissions are coming upstream or downstream. And the way Scope 3, the GHG protocol, presents the data is by the 15 categories. Mm-hmm. But as you just outlined, it's about deploying renewable energy in all upstream and downstream activities. Yeah. So just from an insights and kind of data perspective, how do you, kind of methodologies for translating those 15 categories into actual insights that align with kind of global pathways and trends? Do you see that as kind of a key future direction for Scope 3 to be able to act on the insights at a corporate level?
Yeah. And I think there needs to be more of this. So I would say the most relevant project now is WRI. They have a systems change lab where it's exactly this type of thinking. So they're going to these 15 sectors and then globally developing data and pathways to show globally what needs to happen in each one of these sectors to help us align with the 1.5 degree Celsius. I mean, really, sorry to blow anyone's or to ruin everyone's day, but 1.5 is off the table. Like, unfortunately, looking at the data, we've already surpassed 1.5. Actually, in North America, it's now 1.57 degrees Celsius, or the average temperature anomalies
On the land.
Yeah, and actually at COP27, I think that was the latest climate negotiations, the climate summit in Sharm el Sheikh, and I think that was a more sombering note. I think there was pretty widespread recognition amongst the scientists who were there that 1.5 is really kind of not really within reach. It's now how much can we incrementally shave off in order to get as close as we can to 1.5, but recognizing that that's probably not within reach. And if you follow the news, I mean, it's pretty obvious with 70-day record shattering heat wave in China this year, and all of the flood events that happened from Mississippi to Texas to Kentucky in the United States, and the extreme heat waves that were happening in Pacific Northwest, and the wildfires in California and Australia. I mean, I think there's widespread recognition that we're already feeling the effects of climate change due to 1.5, because that's just an average, right? Global average. So I think the sector is the way to go, and the Systems Change Lab, which is funded by Bezos Earth Fund, like, they're really trying to do that. And what I've been imploring them to do is to get to the corporate level insights and to get to that level of granularity, and because we absolutely need to, because otherwise we don't know what we're benchmarking, right? And so I'm hoping that we can get there, and I'm hoping that efforts like what Terrascope is doing will also help us get to that level of granularity, so that we can be able to say, okay, well, what needs to happen within these sectors, and where and which. And because right now, we, like, honestly, it's very difficult to localize and to granularize that data. We just have, I mean, you can go on that website, it's a beautiful website, but it's like very broad and global. And I've been saying, what about corporate level data? And there's just not enough of it to really have a sense of what needs to happen at that level of granularity. But I'm hoping we can get there. I think that's,
Working on it.
Exactly.
Any other, after.
To your point about renewables, that you said that we already have the technologies today, but can they, so I mean, in my mind, these questions always crop up. Can they really scale? Like, if everybody was to adapt it, can they really scale? And aren't there emissions in producing them? And don't they have a limited lifespan? Like, by the time we get to 2050, wouldn't many of the solar panels already be at the end of their lifespan?
Yes, and I mean, there's constantly innovation going on. So it's not saying that if you implement rooftop solar today, that's going to last like another 3 decades. I mean, obviously there's going to be increasing innovation. And yes, absolutely, there needs to be more investment. But there's just simply not enough adoption. And another chapter in the IPCC, I feel like I'm like a spokesperson for the IPCC, is I believe it was chapter 5, which was a totally new chapter in Working Group 3, which is a demand side chapter. So most of the every other IPCC report has really been focused on the supply side, so electricity supply, energy supply. But for the first time, we included a chapter on the demand side. So what happens when all of us shift the conversation to what can we do as individuals by working from home, or by changing the way that we consume energy and electricity in buildings and making our buildings more efficient. At home, can we make our homes more efficient? Switch out our natural gas stoves and cooktops for induction and electric? Can we change our water heaters to heat pumps, for example? And so a lot of these, what happens? And we found that actually we can reduce emissions across these sectors 40 to 70%. And that's huge. And so it's not just the supply side, but also the demand side. In aggregate, we can actually make a difference. And that's what a lot of the research I've been doing over the last 8 years, looking at corporate action and subnational action, is if we take all of these different efforts, it may not seem like it's a lot. You have one company doing this, one company 20%, 50% there. And what we found is that in 2030, if all of these different corporate and subnational actors follow through, we can reduce emissions an additional 1 to 2 gigatons on top of what national governments have pledged. So that's about 4% of global emissions, Japan and Canada's emissions combined. Just from, and we this is only from companies we have data for. So that's like around 2,000 companies globally. We know that there are a lot more companies that are taking climate actions, and now with this new net zero imperative, a lot more companies have pledged decarbonization. And so that's going to completely shift our models and that estimate. And so I think there actually is a lot that can be done. It feels like it's a lot of incrementalism, and as just one company and one person, you feel like you can't necessarily do a lot. But that chapter also in the IPCC was incredibly powerful in demonstrating the ability of even individuals and individual companies to really make a difference when we aggregate all of our efforts together.
Great message.
We have another question from the online audience. where do you see the most promising opportunities for data science and AI to help companies?
Well, this also, I'm going to sound like a spokesperson for Terrascope, but I think what you're doing is actually really helpful because we need to have a baseline to start with. And I'm of the philosophy of we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And you need to have somewhere to start, even if it's wrong. So for many years, I ran a project at Yale that was called the Environmental Performance Index. And we ranked countries on how well they did on environmental issues like forest protection and air pollution and biodiversity and climate change. And often the countries, they would call me up and they said, I don't agree with your ranking, your data's all wrong. And I said, that's fine, but give me data that's better. If you think this data is poor quality or not accurate, give me data that's better. And that really inspired a lot of them to really get their act together. And so I think the same thing goes for the possibility of data science and machine learning. It's not perfect. I think that's one of my greatest frustrations. We just published a paper in Nature Communications in December where we took self-reported inventories from European cities and we used that to train a gradient boosting model, so XGBoost for folks who are machine learning geeks in the room. And then we had a lot of other geospatial remote sensing inputs. We looked at stationary emission sources, air pollution as a proxy for carbon pollution. We looked at GDP and population and a bunch of different indicators and developed a model to predict for all the other 80,000 cities in Europe that don't report emissions, what their emissions and their likely emissions reductions would be. And it's not perfect, and I was frustrated by the fact that I only had 7,000 inventories. And in the big data realm, that's nothing. I mean, that's like a small amount of data. And but at least it's a start, and it can help us identify at least some indications, some proxies, some predictors of emissions. And I don't think we're ever going to get better unless we at least try something. And we may fail a bunch of times, but then if we can at least like start to put something out there and start the conversation, then we can identify, okay, well, what areas are we most uncertain? Where do we need to improve? And then help better direct our investments, because we have a very limited window of time. The problem with climate change is that it's super wicked. And so the more we try to solve the problem, it's just getting worse day by day. And so we have to really start somewhere. And I think one of the potentials for machine learning and AI is to help us get more efficient, to get smarter about where we make our investments and what areas do we say, okay, this area is really, really bad. We really need to get better on this particular aspect within the supply chain. And then hopefully we'll be able to improve the picture. But for me, that's where where I see a lot of potential is just helping us to establish that baseline, to have some idea of where we're starting. We know it's not perfect. And I think also being honest about that, I think that's one thing I learned, a very hard lesson in working on that project. New Zealand government, not their government, New Zealand citizens very angry at me. Morocco, Costa Rica, I can name a list of countries that were not happy. But through that process and just being really humble about, okay, this is what machine learning can do, this is what it can't do, these are the insights it can lend, but these are the areas of uncertainty that we still have, help us improve. That, to me, seemed to be a much better approach as opposed to saying that this is the say-all, end-all, this is objective, this data is absolutely correct. But being more humble about it and saying, look, we're still learning, this is the best we can do now, and this is where we could use your partnership and collaboration. And so that usually ended up helping us improve the project as opposed to digging our heels in some area that was frankly unproductive and would have, I think, further isolated a lot of countries.
Wonderful. I think, any other questions? But I think I'll jump in with one. So for me, coming from the policy government, it's been really inspiring to see, I think, the level of the data science and seeing these kind of capabilities being applied to an environment and climate problem. And in some ways, it feels like the quality of the machine learning and the way that we're able to apply and to dig in is almost now outstripping some of these more archaic, non-profit driven sources of information. I'm thinking like the emissions factor databases and some of that. So what do you think will be the next frontier for more like emissions factors that are much more granular, right? So at a national level, you smooth out some of the uncertainty. At a city level, you smooth it out. But when you're looking at a company, corporate level, a little bit of variability can have a really big impact. And so how do I'm thinking like, open emission, some emission factor databases are open, do like quality trade-offs there. So what are your thoughts for like the next frontier of emissions factor databases and where we need to go for the future to understand emissions?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I think there's so much in so many different ways that we can answer that because there really is a lot. I think one is like the open data movement. I mean, that's like really big, and you talk about we were talking about regulation. I think that's like really big, getting more people to open up data. And I mean, that's like, I think my biggest frustration is that we really have not seen transparency around climate emissions data improve since I had my first job out of grad school and was training companies to use the GHG protocol, developing the GHG Management Institute curriculum and all those exams. I mean, that's really, I think, kind of depressing, is the fact that we're still not in a better place in terms of the self-reported and the disclosure data than we were 15, 16 years ago. So I think that's like one thing, but I think that would help if we could just have more data, because then that would then, lead into this chain reaction of events where then you could have better machine learning models. They would be more accurate. I mean, I think part of the problem with our machine learning models is that we're using primarily global north data to train our algorithms. And so we know that they're not going to be as accurate applied to the global south. And so how do we like get better data in the global south? And then I think about some of the work that Climate Trace is doing. So they're, they make a lot of promises, but they're claiming to do all the stuff with machine learning. But I think one aspect of their philosophy I think is worth sharing in this context and worth bringing up is the fact that they're looking for proxies. They're gathering all sorts of data on a bunch of other different things. And I think this can relate to the emissions factors. So obviously we want to be able to calculate the per unit emissions for an activity or for a particular product, but then those obviously can be correlated with a lot of other things, right? And so instead of trying to directly estimate the emission factor itself or looking for patterns between different emission factors at different scales try to think about what other proxies there might be available. And so if you're creating a product, like what other correlations, and this is like the value of big data and machine learning and data science, is that you can collect tons and tons of data at this point, and it's not as computationally expensive as it was like 5 or 10 years ago. We have much bigger computers and processing power and cloud computing where you can literally throw whatever you want and try to look for and that's what Climate Trace is kind of doing. And so one of the things that they're saying is that for power plant emissions, we're not going to estimate the emissions themselves, but we're going to look for other emission signatures. And so one of the things they found is that ripples in water. I mean, I don't know how real this is because and that's for another conversation for another time, but that's one of the things they say is highly correlated with emissions. Mm-hmm. So then they don't need to actually go through all the science of decomposing all of the components of emissions coming from a smokestack of a power plant. They can just look at this non-obvious signal of ripples in water. I know, again, I don't know how real that is, but I think we need to, as you said in your opening remarks, we have to think creatively. Like we cannot expect every company to develop custom emissions factors. It's especially from the global south. That's just not a reasonable ask. Mm-hmm. So are there other data that are easier to collect that we can use, that we can collect based on like the big data revolution of consumer activity or satellites, sensors, some of these next generation technologies, and try to look for correlates and proxies that can help us approximate better emissions factors as a better starting point. Because junk in, junk out, and so we can't like keep taking North America, European emission factors and trying to put them through some models and try to expect magic. I think we have to start looking for the non-obvious and more creative signals and get really creative about that kind of data to get better emissions factors. So I think that's one lesson that I've taken away from that particular project, which we evaluated for that National Academy of Sciences report, where I think, just trying to think about the non-obvious signals. And that's what data science and machine learning can help us do.
Right. Yeah, for those breakthroughs.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Angel. I love that that note that kind of
bringing it full circle back to
your
point about creativity. Exactly.
Yeah. We haven't talked. I think we have a couple minutes left. I don't know if anyone has any final questions or thoughts that they want to share. No. Phil's burning for one. No. He had the query look on his face.
Maybe any advice. In a way, you've done a lot of work in this space from many different angles. From all that kind of hard-won insight, what advice might you give us as a company as we kind of pave our way forward so that we can be as impactful as we can be in what we do?
I mean, I would say if you can, I know it's tough because everybody wants to sell data, but if you can try to be open with data and try to contribute data wherever possible, I think that would be hugely impactful. I have a project right now where we're trying to build a digital data commons for climate change. And we're trying to use some of these next generation technologies like homomorphic encryption, zero knowledge proofs, to try to incentivize organizations and companies to contribute data into a virtual decentralized distributed ledger space, for example. And I think we've gotten some traction. So we have a community called the Climate Action Data 2.0 community. Mm-hmm. It's not at a good time for Singapore, unfortunately. We meet once a month, 10:30 a.m. Eastern to I guess 12, which would be midnight when we're on a 12-hour. So it's not super conducive, but it would be great to have folks here because we do have startups, we have digital technologists, we have policymakers, we've got local governments represented, we have academic researchers, and we have a pledge. So if Terrascope is interested in joining this pledge, but it's basically a commitment that we want to work together to try to foster the next generation of climate change data and open data and using digital technology to get us there. And so I think it's been a really great community. I've learned a lot through that. I met a lot of different companies that are kind of working in the same space. I think Terrascope is really aligned with the ethos, and I think this is really needed. I think what we need to recognize is that companies should be selling like the software and the insights derived from the data and not trying to monetize data itself. Because I can't tell you, I get approached probably once a month by some startup. They want me to be a chief scientist on their board. And I say, show me the model, show me the data. And they say, oh, no, we can't. It's all proprietary. And I'm like, why? Like, we're never going to solve climate change if everyone is like stuck in their corner and they're all trying to make money off of the data. And it's like, that's not where the value really is. The value is in what product you're developing or like the insights that you derive, not the data itself. So like, help us solve the problem of climate change by sharing the data, and like whatever we can do to help make that possible. Like we need to come together to think about like how to actually do that. So I've applied for grants from like Amazon and tons of foundations. I mean, right now we have a U.S. National Science Foundation project to try to think about like this idea of a climate data commons and interoperability and how we can use digital tools to help facilitate interoperability. Because you're going to have people in the global south who still are storing their data in an Access database, right? Like, or still on spreadsheets, and you have to like meet them where they're at because they're not going to like understand blockchain, they're not going to understand machine learning. So you have to like really, so that's a lot of what we're trying to do. And frankly, there's a lot of competitors in this space. Microsoft, they have their Carbon Call initiative, and they're trying to be and I'm like, that's not the answer to this problem. Like, we need to be egoless in this, and we need to decentralize, and we all need to be contributing and sharing data. So my advice would be, please join our effort and help us like, be a leader in the space, and say, we're going to actually like share our data and help us get closer to the truth. And I think that would really go on. I mean, that might be a pie in the sky, and you may say, oh, Angel, you don't understand like business models and all this kind of stuff. But I'm trying to encourage these companies who are, and then this space is really blowing up. The Persephone's, the Watershed, I mean, it's all like blowing up. But really, like, let's try to think of a radically new business model where we can share data, we can be really open about it, because we're not going to solve climate change with everybody developing their own proprietary shop and then keeping all the data, squirreling it to themselves. I mean, it's just not going to get us there. And like, been working in this space for a real, and I don't see the picture improving, to be honest. I mean, we're doing a lot more machine learning and fancy stuff, but if we're all using the same like 2,000 inventories from CDP that are open, we're not gonna solve this problem. So yeah, to me it would be try to be as open as possible.
Amazing. Some really good key messages. I think all the technology that we need to decarbonize exists, at least in the short term.
Yes.
Right? We've got the importance of open data and leveling up our skill sets, kind of what we've seen in the spatial mapping, where a lot more open data has come. Like, how does that kind of disrupt the whole climate inventory?
Yeah, exactly.
And just some really amazing insights. So thank you so much for sharing it with us as a company and for being here today. So thank
you so much. Thanks to everyone for your attention and questions. Really great questions.
Thanks.
Thank you.